Welcome to the Seniors Flourish podcast, where it's all about helping occupational therapy practitioners working with older adults be the best they can be. And now your host, Mandy Chamberlain.
Hi guys, welcome to the Seniors Flourish podcast. I'm your host, Mandy Chamberlain. I'm an occupational therapist. And on this show, we like to talk about everything occupational therapy and working with older adults. A couple weeks ago, I had asked everyone on social media a question. The question was, what would you like to learn more about clinically? And so many of you said documentation. So I am listening to all my followers, all the people that check out seniorsflourish.com, that are part of the Learning Lab membership site and listen to this podcast. And so we are doing some different things this month, shaking it up, getting a little crazy. But I decided that I'm going to be partnering with Dee Cornetti and Cindy Kraft of Cornetti and Kraft Healthcare Solutions to bring you the ultimate guide to simplify your documentation. This is going to be a 5-part series. We're going to have a new one each week, talking about different parts of documentation just to help you, clinically. And so this podcast series is for you if you're frustrated with how much time you're spending on your documentation. You're always wondering if Medicare is going to show up at your door because you forgot to include a pain rating for that one patient that one time. Or, you want to simplify your documentation. So it only really includes what is necessary. I mean, it feels like there's so many demands, but what is necessary? And if those things apply to you, then you're really going to love the series. So let me just give you a little bit of background information on Cornetti and Kraft just to really validate why they are the perfect people to be talking about this. So Cornetti and Kraft Healthcare Solutions are physical therapists with over 70 years of clinical management and ownership experience, is a healthcare consulting company with proven expertise in interdisciplinary patient-centered care management to fortify your agency's fiscal security. With professional accountability, leadership, fiscal responsibility, integrity, evidence-based clinical practice strategies, and regulatory expertise, they are committed to an individualized customer experience. They build solutions that fit your needs. Their goal is to ensure therapy remains an integral component of the medical home model through an ever-changing healthcare paradigm. They accomplish this through education, consultation, and interfacing with regulatory bodies and payer sources to provide our clients mentoring, teaching, training, tools, and management resources. So they are going to be taking over the Seniors Flourish podcast. And we're going to have this big, fun, special event at the end of this month, which I'll mention at the end of the podcast. So make sure that you listen all the way to the end. And then I'll also kind of give you an opportunity for a skilled terminology quick reference guide and key phrases for billing and reimbursement that I had put together to help me when I'm doing documentation as well. So I want you to sit back and listen to the great information that Cornetti and Kraft are going to provide for you today. So I hope you find some great information with their expertise.
Hi, I'm Dee Cornetti.
And I'm Cindy Kraft.
And we're with Cornetti and Kraft. And we'd like to bend your ear a little bit today on therapy documentation in home care. So, Cindy, we see a lot of therapy documentation in the course of our workday, and we've had many a conversation about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and sometimes with a cocktail in our hand.
Sometimes it takes more than one after reading the ugly.
And no comment there. So, while we have a couple minutes, let's take an opportunity to discuss a couple of your top 3 concerns with specifically subjective information we commonly see in home health therapy documentation. What's one of them?
Well, I think part of them is the fact that we just don't see it in home health documentation. I mean, I understand that the idea of a SOAP note might seem old school, and some folks really wish we just go back to, give me a piece of paper and a pen and I could just write better documentation and blame my EMR for it. But we really have to go back to those basics, and subjective is a key piece of that. And I think what's happened with many of the electronic medical records is this vicious cycle of we weren't really putting anything in an available box. And you remember as well as I do, Dee, back in the day of paper, very often subjective was followed by a 0 with a line through it, as if we were treating a bunch of patients that were unable to speak at all. And when you see an area where nothing gets put repeatedly, then as the EMR evolves, they tend to drop those off. So many products we see don't really even have a designated space for subjective anymore, and so it just appears to have vanished completely.
Yeah, that just never ceases to amaze me because there's so many things. I've told people like 10 times, just take a tape recorder in the house and turn it on. You'll realize there's a lot of stuff being discussed. Anyway, all right, so there's no information. What's another one of of your top 3 key concerns with subjective information?
I think the other is when there's stuff there, but it's not necessarily relevant. And I don't want to say that in some sort of disparaging, like, you and I are, everything there is to know about documentation and the rest of the world doesn't. I think sometimes we get very caught up in day-to-day stuff we have to get done, and we're missing these opportunities to really simplify what we're trying to say about the importance of patient care. And so we'll see things in there like patient seated in chair upon arrival, patient greeted me at the door, patient allowed me to enter the home. Then we get an in-depth description of the cat or the carpet. And I look at that and say, why? I mean, it's stuff that's in there, but is it really adding value? I mean, I would like to assume that, if we're providing home care, we actually got in the house. So other than the exception of something happened that you didn't get in the house, I'm not sure in every single visit having to announce the fact that you did actually makes any sense for the documentation. And I know pets can absolutely be relevant and impact not only, the plan of care in terms of they're functionally relevant to managing the patient plan, and they can also be a safety issue for providers. But again, do I need a description of every cat, or it's got one eye, or limps funny, or that's where I look at it and say, you've got stuff here, but why is it there? If you look back at this note 6 months from now or a year from now when someone says, hey, what were you doing with this patient? How did it go? Well, I'll be able to recite back to you that they let me in the house and that the cat looked funny, but is that really meaningful information to defend medical necessity?
Cindy, that could be very meaningful because that confirms that the clinician was actually in the house. Because sometimes when you read everything else, you think they could be standing outside the window watching the patient, right? Because there's really there's no tests and measures. There's nothing else that follows with the rest of the note. So I'm kidding.
I know, but I think you're bringing up a valid point. I think that is the essence of why do we need subjective information, because for therapy, we've been beat over the head pretty hard about things need to be objective and quantifiable. But my concern is that that's further overwhelmed the issue about do I even need subjective information. And so we see a lot of notes that do have objectivity, that have measures, that have all that, but there isn't that patient-specific element. So is the value really in describing the cat, or do we need to start honing in on what are those key pieces of information that the patient is giving me, that the caregiver is giving me, that I'm going to use as a therapist in my decision-making process?
Okay, well, there are a lot of us clinicians that actually do document clinically relevant information that's provided by the patient in the subjective part of our note, right? So I mean, knowing you, Cindy, not that you're like a stickler or anything. I didn't say that. I'm not saying that. Is there an issue sometimes with specifically what we tend to focus on in the subjective area if we're, not just putting the one-eyed cat and the one-winged bird and the dog that drags its back left leg. Let's say we actually use clinical information. What kind of stuff are you commonly seeing?
Well, I think somewhere along the line, we came to believe collectively that subjective information is really complaint-oriented, as if subjective is a complaint box, that the patient is either complaining about something or has no complaints. And I think no complaints ends up being the default placeholder a lot of times when there is a subjective area for documentation. And I think it's unfortunate. I think that we've forgotten that gleaning subjective information, by its very definition, is getting information from the patient perspective. I can't infer it. I can't assume it. I can't say, well, I know what this means to the patient. I have to get it from them. And so, yes, if they're having a challenge or a problem, we want to know that because we're out there to be problem solvers. But I think over the course of care, when we look past just that initial assessment time frame, that when we go back on a visit and the patient says that they tried something we recommended and it worked really well, it was successful, or they're feeling more confident, or they're doing more, the things that make our job rewarding, that give us that warm and fuzzies and reinforce that what we're doing in our treatment planning is actually working, I rarely, if ever, see that documented. And it's like, why do we not take credit where credit is due? That our interventions are working, that they are creating meaningful change. And again, I think we've gotten very stymied in the, well, I'll show that in my objective information. I can show you that he walks better or bathes with less assistance or communicates more effectively. That's great. I'm glad you have objective stuff to back that up. But we know the overriding issue that has been, kind of thrown at therapy is you got to be measurable and you got to be meaningful. And meaningfulness is not what I say, isn't it great you can walk further than when I met you, but what does that mean to the patient from their perspective in their words? So we're not suggesting that you write down everything the patient says, because you know as well as I do, Dee, if we did that, 90% of the documentation of subjective would be about their bowels. I mean, because they're more than happy to talk about their bowels with any healthcare person coming in the door. But I think it's those things where we have to start paying attention to, what did this patient or their caregiver say to me on this visit that made me go, that was relevant to me, that I took it and filed it away with, this is going to help shape my plan. This is going to help drive the care. This is going to help me make decisions. And I think the hard part of it is, Steve, when we started out early in our career, we paid a lot more attention to this kind of detail because we had those little checklists somewhere. Make sure you ask this, make sure you check this, make sure you write this down. Well, we don't carry those lists anymore, and I'd be scared if we did, and so would our patients if we couldn't do a doggone thing without looking it up. But I think our familiarity with these concepts has really been the undoing of our documentation. We're simply not paying attention to that kind of detail. So we get trapped with the no complaints, or is it really relevant since I have to have objective detail? And we really just have to check ourselves and simplify this in a way that says, what are those key things a patient or a caregiver has said to me that made me go, wait a minute, those are the things I want to see in that subjective information. Not like Cindy Kraft wants to see it because she's going to police your work, but those are the things that I as an individual therapist want to put in there because it speaks volumes about the value of my care. And I also think, Dee, it has to be inclusive of caregiver feedback as well, especially because the classic thing is when what the caregiver tells you and what the patient tells you are slightly different stories. And sometimes it's very helpful to have the caregiver there to go, wait a minute, what are you talking about? You can't do that. Or he got out of the chair for you and he never gets out of the chair for me. We synthesize that information, but is that valuable to record? Because if there is that disconnect, then maybe the patient's statement of their ability might be a little questionable. How could this affect the teaching dynamic? Who's going to assist the patient going forward? When that caregiver follows you out to the car and starts banging on your car window about, hey, listen, we need to have a conversation about the real story, do elements of that end up in the documentation as well? So again, this is not meant to be, oh my gosh, Cornetti and Kraft is going to tell me I got to write more, but it's really getting us to check ourselves and get to the essence of information that we know is important. And subjective cannot be sacrificed for all of the objective things we need to have. The patient element is critical.
Okay, all right. So we don't want to be hypercritical, right? But,
right.
We see a fair amount of documentation. I would agree with you that it falls into those categories. So what, how you're walking up to the person's door for that day, whether you've seen them the last visit or you haven't seen them since the evaluation, or, you haven't seen them for the week you've been on vacation, or, you don't see them but once every other week. I don't know. The point is, how do you get to that? Is there something like as you knock on the door and say hi, that you can recommend to therapists that might help them trigger, what is good information, like how you would get that conversation started? Is there anything that you might say, or any tips you might give clinicians to try to hone in on what's relevant or get the patient or the caregivers focused on giving you really good information? I mean, it's not all going to happen up front. I get that, but how can you start that conversation?
I think part of it is really framing it in the what has been working well since the last time I saw you. I think sometimes we need to start with the positive to get the whole visit framing in a what is working well, what is getting better. I think a lot of our folks, especially those with chronic disease and multiple medical conditions, a lot of it is focused on what doesn't work, what I'm not feeling well with, and what's not going right for me. So I like to start with what has been going well since the last time I saw you. And it's not just about, did you do the exercises I gave you? It's not just, I'm checking up to see if you did it, but what has worked well? And if it's nothing, well, okay, what about this? Or what about this one thing we talked about this last time, or what we've been working on? And then I like to go to what has been a challenge for you? Sometimes the challenge is I wasn't able to do the exercises because I was having a really bad day. Well, then that tells me, wait a minute, have I set them up appropriately of what they should do on a good day and what they should do on a not so good day? Because we know many of our patients think that you're only supposed to exercise when you feel up to it, and when you don't, then they don't. And if I haven't seen him in 2 weeks and he hasn't felt good for 1 week worth of that and hasn't done anything because of it, then it's not necessarily a compliance issue as much as it is have I built the appropriate program for them? Have I really addressed those kinds of issues? So the challenges and what's worked well or what's been a challenge for them, I find very helpful in trying to frame that conversation out of the realm of kind of everything is a negative, what's gone wrong, or almost a police state kind of inquiry about, did you do what I told you? Which I think makes many of our patients fib, quite honestly, because do they really want, when a patient tells me I haven't done anything you said since the last time I was here, I'm almost shocked at their candor and go, wow, because it's a lot easier if you would tell me the truth. But I think we really need to look at how we frame both what's gone well and what's been a challenge for them since the last time they were seen.
Yeah, and, I think also just asking them, how do you feel you're doing? You know, and that's kind of like a variation on a theme, but that's typically what I do when I walk in the house. I said, I haven't seen you for a week, so what's been going on? What's changed? And when we read some of the information that we have, sometimes patients will, even unsolicited, or at least we don't know, they'll give some really good information. And a lot of times I'll see in the documentation quotes, right? What'll say, my heart is acting up today, right? And what amazes me when that information is put in the chart is that it appears that the rest of the documentation just kind of goes what was normally planned. Like, yeah, okay, thanks for filling me in. Let's get on with what I came here to do. You have any thoughts, Cindy, about, okay, let's say we gather the right information. What if it kind of is not what you expected, or it throws you off course? What should follow after that? It just sounds like, yep, checked it off. The heart was acting up. I moved on. What would you recommend? Well,
I think part of that comes, Dee, from the fact that we fundamentally hate documentation. That's not why we became therapists. And sometimes I feel it was an element of false advertising. We weren't told how much there was going to be. So it turns it into a checklist idea. So we see things not only of, my heart is acting up, but my pain is a 10. And then it looks like the same thing was done on the visit as it was the last time when the patient said it was a 2. So the patient telling you their pain has changed that dramatically, you don't do anything with it, just says, wait a minute, again, is your head in the game? I'm collecting this information. What am I doing with it? The other one, and I've shared this with you, Dee, but I got to use it here briefly, is a patient that has been seen for a while whose exercise program predominantly consisted of ankle pumps to the tune of 60 reps of said ankle pumps. And the therapist wrote in the subjective area a direct quote from the patient that the patient was frustrated that their lower extremity strength was not improving as fast as he should. He said his legs were not getting stronger like he thought they should. And then they went ahead and did 60 more ankle pumps. That just speaks to a disconnect that says, what are we doing with the documentation? I'm collecting subjective information to guide my care. So if I find something I didn't expect, or I'm getting a statement from the patient that says, I tried to go in the basement and it was a disaster, and we've never tried the basement steps prior to now, and I apparently don't say anything about it, don't do anything about it, don't attempt to troubleshoot it on the course of the visit, then it says, then why were you there? What were you trying to accomplish? Our plan for that visit really needs to be shaped in part by what we're hearing from this patient. And I think a final piece of that, Dee, is we see it in the conditions of participation. Those updated COPs are being very clear, not about gait training, transfer training, and TheraX. They're talking about you have to show patient involvement and engagement. And that has got to be more than patient agreed with my plan of care or patient has no complaints.
Yeah, well, I think that you have dropped a serious knowledge bomb today. So thanks a lot for just giving us all that expertise.
Oh, right. And I look forward to the next one, Dee, because then I get to poke the bear on one of your favorite topics, which is objective information.
All right. Peace out, y'all.
So there you have it. I hope you appreciated Cindy and Dee talking about the subjective portion of documentation. I know I always find it helpful, and it's always nice to hear, get some new tips and hearing from people that actually know exactly what we need to be doing. So the special event I mentioned at the beginning of the episode is that we're going to be doing a live interactive webinar where you can bring your documentation questions to Cindy and Dee. So anything you want to know about documentation, management, OASIS, regulations, they will be all yours for 1 hour. So all you have to do is go over to seniorsflourish.com/live and sign up just so you can get access to the webinar. Once again, it's seniorsflourish.com/live. Also over on that, page of the website, I also have that free PDF for skilled terminology and quick reference guide with key phrases for billing and reimbursement. Just a little list of some really helpful things that you can have handy. So when you're doing your documentation, you can use some of those phrases to making sure that you're using words that are skilled. So make sure you tune in next week as Cindy and Dee will be talking all about the objective portion of documentation and what that data actually and how that data actually matters to your patients and your payers. All right, guys, until next time.
This podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Senior Rehab Project at seniorrehabproject.com.